Okay, so we're sitting here with the renowned Chris Hedges. If you don't know him, he was a war correspondent for the New York Times for how many years, Chris?
15.
For 15 years. You've been around the world. You've seen it all. You are one of the people that if there's a hero in my book, you're a hero in my book. I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and congratulate you for all your hard work. This event here has one goal, which is, and I pulled this off their website, and that one goal is to craft a response to the crises that we face. In your eyes, what are those crises, and what should the response look like?
Well, the crisis has been engendered by, in essence, a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion. Corporations have seized all of the centers of power. Not only the three branches of government, the judiciary, legislative, and executive branch, but they've rigged the political process itself so that, in essence, money has replaced the vote. We have huge, very costly political spectacles built around electoral politics, but none of the fundamental structures of predatory capitalism are changed. And you see complete continuity between the Bush administration and the Obama administration. In fact, Obama's environmental record is as bad or worse than Bush's. Obama has carried out a far more egregious assault on civil liberties than Bush. And that means that we have to step outside the system and respond. But I think that you see at this conference people groping for what that response will be, because the corporate entities that essentially have seized control, and of course seized control of our systems of information, are impervious to what the citizen's rights, the citizen's needs. They're irrelevant. And the more restive the population becomes, the more the corporate state uses harsher and more draconian forms of control. We see it in Ferguson, but that's been evident, in marginalized neighborhoods for a very long time. We, of course, incarcerate 25% of the world's population. This is our surplus labor. And it's hard to know how to craft a response to an entity that is utterly tone deaf to the destruction of the ecosystem and the rights and needs of working men and women who they have, wages in this country have either declined or remained stagnant now for 3 decades. That's not going away. I mean, none of the kind of unionized jobs that created a viable middle class in this country are coming back. And the corporate state certainly knows it, and they have put into place all sorts of controls so that if people rise up, they'll be crushed. And it is a terrible, terrible quandary, coupled with the fact that every climate change report that comes out is far more dire than the last, and that climate scientists are now in every report that comes out saying that this whole process is proceeding or accelerating at a rate that no one predicted.
Yep. So, I mean, given these dire scenarios that we're facing and the lack of response thus far, is there hope in your eyes that at one point in time we as Americans and citizens of the world can respond to this in an effective way, or are the powers that be, do they have such a death grip on our system that crafting this response, or even coming up with a response that is effective in the long run, is it possible at this point in time in your eyes?
Well, civilizations throughout human history have collapsed. I think there's been roughly about 24 civilizations, and you have anthropologists like Tainter and others with the collapse of complex societies, and Redman and Ronald Wright, and that great study, I forget the author, Easter Island, Easter Earth, that have looked at how the twilight of civilizations and how they in essence, kind of commit collective suicide. Easter Island being a good example. I mean, what were they thinking when they cut down
Jared
the last
Diamond.
tree? Jared Diamond is another one. He draws a lot on Tainter.
Yeah.
And so we would have to break the pattern.
Right.
The difference is that when this, if we want to call it, for lack of a better term, a civilization, is global. So that when we go down, the whole planet will go with us. There will be no new lands to conquer, no new indigenous peoples to subjugate, no new natural resources to plunder. I mean, that part of the problem now is that because we can't just drop a drill bit in the ground to extract oil, we are getting this dirty energy through fracking, and this, we're kind of scraping up the last dregs of what's there, which means that we haven't confronted as a civilization that it's the end.
Right.
The systems of mass propaganda have been quite effective in terms of Derek quite correctly calls them electronic hallucinations, keeping people enveloped in a non-reality based universe, essentially disseminated through the airwaves, and the population is kind of mesmerized that, including this implicit sort of mania for hope, that progress is lineal, progress is inevitable, science and technology will save us. I mean, the idea that we can adapt to climate change is as self-delusional as people who deny the existence of climate change, and yet those really are the two kinds of strains. And we see cosmetic measures that are adopted, but none of which address the fundamental need for a very radical reorientation of our relationship, not only to the ecosystem but to each other.
Right.
And that's just not out there. And I have, as a war correspondent, covered societies like Yugoslavia that went down, and people have a very hard time understanding the fragility of the systems that they live in, and it's only when the systems actually disintegrate, even though all the signs of disintegration are right in front of them, that they can finally grasp reality.
Right. Derek Jensen mentions this concept of like, when is enough enough? Is it when 90% of all the fish in the ocean are dead? Will you stand up and start fighting back? I see this march towards catastrophe, and I don't sense there's really any urgency of the American people, of the American populace, and people of other nationalities and other countries, and yet it seems as though we have to stand up and start fighting back, otherwise all hope will be lost.
Well, that's it. Well, we do have to stand up and fight back. Unfortunately, we're not doing it. And those who, I mean, you look at the big green environmental movements, they've essentially been bought off, especially by the fossil fuel industry and big coal. You see symbolic actions. The climate march would be one where 400,000 people stay within carefully designed police lines.
Sure.
And, are actually herded on the other side of Manhattan, so they're on the opposite side of the UN. The UN isn't even in session when they march. And I'm not, I think I think the climate march was worth doing, but the idea that this is even remotely enough, or that we are going to succeed as long as we obey the rules, and the climate march did obey the rules, is very naive. It's only when we begin to actually disrupt the mechanisms of power that we have any hope of having an effect, and we're not there yet.
Well, I don't think we're there yet at all, because I don't see anybody really at this point in time disrupting the mechanisms, of this horrible system. It seems like that needs to happen quickly, and yet I don't think people are willing to kind of put their lives on the line to jeopardize the system that provides for them. I mean, how can you be angry at a system that gives you, theoretically everything you need, your food and your transportation? So it seems like it's a very tall order, and yet it's the only thing that would give us hope. So what do you say to people? What would you say to people to get them up off their couch and to, in a sense, fight back? What's the narrative?
The problem is that this system is quite effective at the moment of giving this false sense of security, this false illusion that they will be able to sustain the population. And it's probably, and I speak out of my own experience as a war correspondent, only when the system collapses which all the indicators now point as an inevitability,
Right.
that people actually, it's when they go down to the supermarket and there's nothing there,
Yeah.
or when the water
Right.
doesn't come out of the tap,
Right.
or whatever, then they get it.
Right.
But at that point, of course, it's
too late.
too late.
Right. So even this concept, and I've said this before, is that it has to get worse before it can get better. But in the situation that we're encountering as a species now, the situation is going to get so bad that a
Right.
response after the fact is not going to
It's
do
probably
much.
too late right now. I mean,
Right.
and this is the tragedy. And I think for those of us who, are quite conscientious about reading the science reports, you fight a kind of daily
Yep.
struggle with
Yep.
depression,
Yep.
especially if you
Yep.
have children, as I
Yep.
do.
Yep. So given again the dire situation, how does love and kind of community fit into the equation, and what tools can we use to move forward, knowing the gravity of the situation, to maybe make things, I don't know, but I mean, what
we have to resist. We have a moral imperative to resist, and we have to
Right.
stop asking ourselves whether or not we're going to be
Right.
successful.
Right.
That's really what we have to do. And I think most rebels, like most artists, as Baldwin pointed out, are not so much driven by a vision as possessed by it. Hannah Arendt said, when talking about the rise of Nazism in Germany, that it's not those who say this shouldn't be done, or we oughtn't to do this. It's those who say, I can't be part of this system.
Right.
And we can't speak about hope if we don't actually engage in acts of resistance.
Right.
And yet at the same time, we don't want to have a kind of false optimism, which is kind of endemic within American society, this kind of obsession for happy thoughts. We have to at once confront the reality of what lies before us, and then not let that reality paralyze us. We have
Right.
to, keep ourselves lucid
Right.
in a moment of, a very catastrophic moment in human history, and yet at the same time respond. Because if we're not responding to reality, then we're not going to be effectual. The idea that the system has the capacity to reform itself, for instance.
Right.
And you have, major climate or environmental organizations that operate on that assumption, is an inability to face the structures of power and assess them correctly. And yet to face the structures of power and assess them correctly is so demoralizing as to engender essentially a kind of passivity in the face of inevitable annihilation.
Mm-hmm. Our culture seems to be defined by violence. Our government obviously is exceedingly violent. Seems as though we're rapidly approaching, a police state. How do you fight that system effectively? What does this resistance look like when you have, the most well-armed, heavily, militarized state on the planet? How do you affect that? Without getting
by building mass movements of
Yeah.
sustained civil disobedience that are
Yeah.
nonviolent. Because
Yeah.
if you the state speaks the language of violence very well. That's
Right.
the one thing they do really
and we
well.
won't win if we're violent.
And we won't win. And
Right.
so I think, I covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe. It's pouring hundreds of thousands of people day in and day out into the streets to discredit the regime, hoping that you can get the foot soldiers of the elite, the police, the bureaucrats, the civil service, to, in essence, defect to your side. I'm not naive enough to tell you that's going to work, but it's probably the last hope that we have.
Right, and I just talked about a police state. Where do you feel as though we are at this point in time? Is it a quasi kind of soft police state, or are we already?
Well, it's not a quasi soft police state when you don't have any privacy. I mean,
Right.
when we're the most heavily monitored, watched, surveilled, eavesdropped population in human history, and I covered the Stasi state in East Germany.
Right.
And you can't use the word liberty when your government watches you 24 hours a day. That's the relationship of a master and a slave.
Right.
There's no investigative journalism if there's no possibility that those within the centers of power who seek to report abuses can no longer remain anonymous. That's why Snowden had to flee the country. So I think we are living in a species of corporate totalitarianism, which is different from fascism or different from communism, but essentially has managed to turn all of the mechanisms of power over to a tiny elite, and that's, of course, the concentration of power within the hands of a tiny elite is essentially what totalitarianism is about, and subject the citizenry to a regime of constant surveillance, fear, impoverishment. I mean, people, half or more of this country now are hanging on by their fingertips economically, and of course all of their energy is being put into the struggle to sustain themselves, and then people come home so exhausted they can't resist, which is kind of part of the plan.
Last question. I forgot what I was going to ask him. So this horrible situation with our climate, with the environment, complete collapse, seems imminent. Obviously, our government and the governments of the world are aware of what's happening. They're pretending, though, that everything is fine and just keep shopping. I feel as though the leaders of this country and the leaders of many other countries are guilty of crimes against humanity because they're allowing this situation to exist and they're not taking the actions necessary. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, I just think just in terms of Iraq and Afghanistan, they're guilty. The leaders of this country, including Barack Obama, are guilty of war crimes.
Can we place the blame, a lot of this, on the world's leaders that have just been completely ineffective?
No, because these leaders are corporate employees. I mean, they serve corporate power, and if they don't serve corporate power, they're not. So they are the public face. Obama functions as a kind of brand for corporate power. But like Bush and like whoever succeeds Obama, he will, if he doesn't serve corporate power, he's not going to, he's not going to be there. I think that it's a mistake to focus on political personalities and not look closely at the system of what Sheldon Wolin in his great book Democracy Incorporated calls our inverted totalitarianism. Because when we focus on personalities, and these are manufactured personalities by public relations people, we tend to think that those personalities actually make a difference in how we're governed, and they don't. They really don't. And it's, again, that's part of the problem of the inability to grasp the superstructure of corporate power and how it functions, which of course is global. And that's what all these trade agreements are about. It's about weakening the sovereignty of the states, which is a process that's already begun, but the TPP and others will exacerbate. And I think that that's the problem, that the only way to understand the structures of power, the only prescient critiques of power are now essentially so shut out of the mainstream that Wolin's book, and Wolin is our greatest living political philosopher, hands down, taught at Berkeley and Princeton. It was never reviewed, because that critique is unacceptable to a corporate-controlled media. So I think that we have to educate ourselves about power, and that once we educate ourselves about power and grasp how corporate power works, and this species of inverted totalitarianism, which has characteristics which are different from other totalitarian systems, then we can respond to it. But if we don't understand power, then we are going to be manipulated by power.
So the only thing left for us is try to maybe decapitate the corporate state, which, as you're suggesting, really dominates the discussion in a playing field. And it seems as though that as we talk about it's a revolution of choice, where we as individuals can start making different decisions, which removes some of the power of the corporate state and allows us to move in a more sustainable.
Anything we can do to hurt the corporate state is good. I mean, it's why I became a vegan. Because I want to hurt the animal agriculture industry, which is a major, some people say the most important cause of climate change. I think in any single way, no matter how small, we can diminish corporate power. That is a form of resistance. It's why building local, sustainable communities, especially around food, are essential. So, at this point, everything counts. We may not make it,
Right.
but we really have to, in the choices that we make every day in our lives, make sure that every day we're doing something to work to diminish corporate control.
Right. So what would you say if you had an opportunity to go to a grade school or a high school and sit down with some children and give them a synopsis of the situation? What would you call on them to do? Yeah, what would you say to them?
That they've been betrayed by my generation, grossly and unfairly betrayed, and that their future, not only their future, but their very lives are now in jeopardy, and that it's an absolute imperative that they stand up and work to dismantle this system, or within perhaps a few years or a couple of decades, life on much of the planet will not even be feasible.
Yep. Yeah, so I agree with you that things are that dire, and I don't feel as though we're moving in the right direction, and I don't really see the energy and the intensity that I think we're going to need to remotely even shift the direction. So, but I appreciate you sitting down with us today, and we're trying to get the message out because obviously, we do need all hands on deck here, and it is the age of information, and the more people are aware of how dire things are, hopefully we can get a response that's appropriate and start dismantling the corporate state as you're suggesting, because it seems like that could be our only option. Is there anything else you wanted to say in closing? Good. All right, well, thank you very much for sitting down with us. Very much appreciate it. Yep. Very nice meeting you. Continue to follow your work closely. Thanks. And keep up the good work. Yeah, thanks. All right.
Not only the three branches of government, the judiciary, legislative, and executive branch, but they've rigged the political process itself so that, in essence, money has replaced the vote. We have huge, very costly political spectacles built around electoral politics, but none of the fundamental structures of predatory capitalism are changed, and you see complete continuity between the Bush administration and the Obama administration. They're irrelevant, and the more restive the population becomes, the more the corporate state uses harsher and more draconian forms of control. We see it in Ferguson, but that's been evident, in marginalized neighborhoods for a very long time. We, of course, incarcerate 25% of the world's population. This is our surplus labor. And it's hard to know how to craft a response to an
Okay, so we're sitting here with the renowned Chris Hedges. If you don't know him, he was a war correspondent for the New York Times for how many years, Chris?
15.
For 15 years. You've been around the world. You've seen it all. You are one of the people that if there's a hero in my book, you're a hero in my book.
In fact, Obama's environmental record is as bad or worse than Bush's. Obama has carried out a far more egregious assault on civil liberties than Bush. And that means that we have to step outside the system and respond. But I think that you see at this conference people groping for what that response will be, because the corporate entities that essentially have seized control, and of course seized control of our systems of information, are impervious to what the citizen's rights, the citizen's needs.
I really appreciate the work that you're doing, and congratulate you for all your hard work. This event here has one goal, which is, and I pulled this off their website, and that one goal is to craft a response to the crises that we face. In your eyes, what are those crises, and what should the response look like?
Well, the crisis has been engendered by, in essence, a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion. Corporations have seized all of the centers of power.